Hi, welcome to Icons. I'm your host, Walt Zmed, and my guest today is Arthur Benveniste.
How do you do?
And this is the second time you've been on a show, but it's been quite a while since you've been here. So a lot has happened since then, and the topic we're going to discuss is the crypto-Judaic studies, sort of an update on it. And these are about the lost Jews of Spain and Portugal.
Yes.
So, Arthur, where have you been? What has happened since last time you were here?
Well, since I was here last, I've been back to Spain and Portugal. We had a conference in Portugal, but I went early and traveled through Spain also. I've been to South America a total of 4 times now, several in conjunction with crypto Jews. Last year I was in Peru, where I tried to contact a group of crypto Jews in the town of Cajamarca. I couldn't find them. When I returned to Lima, I talked to one of the crypto Jews there that I knew, and he told me, oh, they've all left and moved to Israel. So,
okay, now let's get into explaining to our audience what crypto Jews are and how they came about.
Okay, in 1492, 1492 was a big year in Spain. It wasn't just the year that Columbus sailed.
Yes.
1492 opened, January 2nd, the Moors surrendered in Granada, so finally the Catholics controlled the entire peninsula. Later in the year, Ferdinand and Isabella announced that they were going to merge the 2 kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, into one country. So the country of Spain was actually created that year. And on March 31st of that year, Ferdinand and Isabella went down to the Alhambra, this magnificent palace that the Moors had in Granada.
It was a major learning center, too.
Yes. And they announced what became known as the Alhambra Decree. All Jews must either convert to Catholicism or leave the country by August 1st of that year. And by coincidence, or maybe not by coincidence, August 1st was the Jewish holiday of Tisha B'Av, which commemorates the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So it's an extra sad day for Jews. So about half the Jews of Spain left the country, including my ancestors.
Okay. And what numbers are we talking about, approximately?
Okay, the historians disagree a great deal. The lowest number I've seen is 50,000. The highest is 200,000. We don't know. But it was a sizable number. Of those who left Spain, we think about half originally went to Portugal. And then in 1497, the King of Portugal wanted to marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella.
For good political reasons.
For political reasons, certainly. There was a dispute as to whether he was legitimately the king. So one of his advisors, who was a converted Jew, said, why don't you marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and this will give you a stronger claim to the throne. So they wrote to Madrid asking for young Isabella's hand. She had the same name as her mother. And the answer came back, okay, if you expel the Jews. So he ordered all the Jews to leave by a certain date, it was 1497, but rather than let them leave, he had them gather in a square, and while they were gathered there, priests circulated amongst them and sprinkled them with holy water, and then the Archbishop announced that they've all been converted. So they sent a message to Madrid saying there are no Jews in Portugal, and 5 days later they signed the marriage agreement. So these Jews, the king was wise enough to know that this little ceremony didn't make good Catholics. So he said, you have 20 years to become good Catholics. You may still have some Jewish practices at home in private. You may not have public ceremonies. You may not have synagogues. You must attend church. So this is the beginning of crypto-Judaism. So 1497 in Portugal, where they're practicing Judaism at home, but going to church.
So what kind of practices, I mean, were they doing at home that obviously was not in public view?
The ones that could easily be practiced at home were the dietary laws. They wouldn't eat pork or shellfish, mix meat and milk, etc. Lighting candles on Friday, often in secret. Not eating bread during Passover. Now, they lost the Jewish calendar for the most part, but they could date many Jewish holidays by the Catholic calendar. So Passover would be 1 week before Easter, and Hanukkah before Christmas.
Now, I imagine that since they had to keep this quiet, that the children, you know, you couldn't tell them why they're doing that, otherwise they'd be out in telling everything. So all the children knew were the rituals that became part of the tradition that was repeated year after year.
Right. We find many of their descendants today who grew up with these rituals, the candle lighting, the dietary laws, who didn't know why until they began investigating.
And another ritual you had mentioned earlier related to card playing.
Yes.
That's a very interesting story.
I first became aware of that in 1992, and that was the 500th anniversary of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. I was a party that went to, I was with a party that went to Spain under the invitation of the king, Juan Carlos. And the Rabbi Baruch Garçon, who was the chief rabbi of Spain at the time, told a story. The Jews of Spain, the small Jewish community that's in Spain today, wanted to buy some land in the north near Barcelona to build a summer camp for children. So he went up north, it was in September, and contacted a man that had some land for sale, and they discussed the price. And the rabbi said, I'll return to Madrid and I'll contact you next week, and then we can sign the papers. But when he returned to Madrid, he got a phone call from the man in Barcelona saying, I can't sign the papers next week, but I can sign them later. Excuse me. So the rabbi said, okay, well, when can you sign? And he said, well, these are 3 dates when I'm not allowed to sign. And the dates turned out to be the Jewish high holidays. So
and he was not aware
that
it was
not aware of what they were. So the rabbi said, well, why can't you sign on those dates? And he said, well, we have a funny calendar. And this is the only example I've ever heard of anybody preserving the old Hebrew calendar. And said, we have a calendar and there are certain dates when we can't do business. And the rabbi said, well, what are the dates for next year? And turned out they were the Jewish high holidays. So the rabbi asked him, well, what do you do on those days? And he says, oh, we play cards. Excuse me. The rabbi said, the man said, we play cards. And he didn't know why. And the rabbi then explained that during the time of the Spanish Inquisition, Jews would sit around a table with cards on the table and prayer books on their laps. And when somebody came by, they'd play cards, and then when they were alone again, they'd go back to the prayer books. So you pass this on from generation to generation, and each generation
loses a little bit something,
alters it.
But the card playing stayed.
The card playing stayed. So this story was so interesting to me that whenever I spoke, I lecture a great deal. I always tell this story. While I was speaking in Tucson, Arizona, excuse me, and I told this story. And in the audience was somebody from the local Tucson Jewish newspaper who wrote it down and published it in the paper. A copy of the paper got to New Mexico. In New Mexico, there's a woman named Emma Moya who writes for a magazine. There's a magazine there called La Herencia del Norte, Northern Heritage, and it's a genealogical newspaper for New Mexico. And she writes articles about the secret Jews of New Mexico. And when she saw this, she wrote back to the Jewish newspaper of Tucson, and they forwarded it to me. And she said, in New Mexico, we call card playing barajas. In Spanish, everywhere else in the Spanish word, in the world, it's called cartas. And she said the Academia Ibérica in Albuquerque, which does research on Hebrew genealogy and such, traced the word baraja to the Hebrew word beraha, meaning prayer. And obviously, it comes from the fact that they played cards as part of their praying. Well, this came to me in 1999, and just shortly after I received this, we were having a conference in Los Angeles on crypto-Jews. So I decided I'll present this at the conference. Before I got to speak, the person that was up before me was an anthropologist from Denver. And he was showing some videos of interviews with crypto-Jews, mostly in New Mexico. And one woman was describing how her family would play cards every September to commemorate the Jewish high holidays, and they called cards barajas. So then I went up and told my story, and then I wrote an article and I put it on the internet. Well, since then I've received 5 replies from various people that play cards, crypto-Jews who play cards with some kind of Jewish connection. Usually it's on the Jewish high holidays.
Were most of them aware of the fact?
Many of them didn't know. A few of them were. One of them played cards on Saturday, and they mentioned how they had to hide the fact that it was a Jewish ritual. They had to hide it from the army. So they did it in secret. And the others played cards in September to commemorate the Jewish high holidays. One of them described a card game they played where each card had a meaning, and the meanings were related to Jewish history. And the king, queen, and jack had different names. And the name word, the slang word they used for the queen was a slang word for prostitute. But they all had something to do with Jewish rituals.
And I imagine that these people that discovered this, all of a sudden it was like a revelation.
Yes.
Now they know why they were doing that all of these years, all of these generations.
Yes. Yeah.
And you, of course, your family comes from that period of time too, and your family left to what part of the world?
Well, my family left Spain, settled in Salonika, which became a major Jewish center. Salonika was the only large city in the world that had a Jewish majority up until about 1900. They settled in Salonika right after 1492. In 1522, the Turks conquered the island of Rhodes, which was ruled by the Knights of Rhodes, the Knights of St. John. Now they're known as the Knights Hospitallers. They still exist. In 1522. 1528, the Sultan wanted to develop the commerce on the island. So what better way to develop commerce but to bring in some Jews? So he settled 40 Jewish families in Rhodes. One of them was my family. And my family lived in the same house for 400 years until 1944. During the war, the British were bombing German ships in the harbor, and 3 of the bombs fell short, landed in the Jewish quarter. One of them hit our house, killing my grandmother.
So was your family aware that they were of your Jewish heritage, of course,
yes,
because they were allowed to practice Judaism
we practiced
there?
openly. We weren't secret.
Okay, and then after that tragedy of World War II, then that's when you came to the United States?
No, my father and mother came before the war. My father actually came in 1916. My mother in 1927. Yeah.
And what got you interested in crypto-Judaism?
I had a vague knowledge of marranos. The word marrano actually is a pejorative. It means swine. But it was a word that was applied to Jews who had converted to Christianity but were not authentically Christian, that were still practicing Judaism. When I was in college, my cousin was also at USC, and one day he came to me and he said, "Look, I found this book in the library." It was a book on the Jews of Spain, and our name was in it.
Wow. So
I got fascinated. So since then I've been collecting, I've been doing research on our name, and and in conjunction with that I've been doing research on the Jews that remained in Spain or came to the New World, to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, and continued practicing Judaism in secret.
But when you say on your name, you're talking about Benveniste.
Benveniste, yeah.
Yeah, and there's an interesting story behind that name as well that comes from Spain.
Yeah, according part of the family mythology that I picked up in Israel from another Benveniste. The word Benveniste means he who was welcomed. It's related to the Spanish word bienvenido, which means welcome. And the story is that there was a Jewish advisor to the king he was an expert on medicinal plants. And as he was walking with the king, he was pointing out the various plants in the garden, and this plant has this name and is used for this treatment, etc. There's a plant called malva. Mal is evil or bad, evil going, malva. But when he came to that plant, he called it bienva, well going. somebody overheard them and said, that's wrong. Why did you deceive the king? You gave him the wrong name for this plant. You called it good going, well going, rather than evil going. And this man said, well, before the illustrious majesty, I can't give a name like evil going.
See, there was politically correct ways of saying things even at that time.
Right. So the king says, well, thank you so much, and because of this, I'm going to call it, from now on, you will be known as the welcomed one, El Benveniste. So that's how the word came around.
So, and that's part of your family tradition.
Yes.
And since we're in Spain now, and we're just talking about it, you've got some photographs. We got a few photographs to look at, which are rather interesting. If they can show them on the screen, and you can explain what they are, because here are some of the archaeology that you've done.
Actually, this photo is from Portugal. It's from the town of Guarda, which is right at the Spanish border. In fact, the town is called Guarda because it guards Portugal from Spanish invasion.
And those symbols, what do they mean?
These symbols are, in the old Jewish quarter, many of the houses have these symbols. It's an orb with the cross on top. And that was the mark of the Inquisition to show that this family had converted to Catholicism.
Okay. Let's say what this one is.
This is the home of Aristides de Sousa Mendes. He was the Portuguese diplomat in Bordeaux during the war. And he rescued 10,000 Jews by giving them visas to Portugal.
Okay.
This young man, his name is José João Mendes Rodrigo. He is from the town of Belmont, Portugal. In 1919, a Polish Jewish mining engineer he had a contract to work for several years in that area, a very isolated area. And he discovered a community of Jews living there secretly. And when he told them that he was Jewish, they said, that's impossible. We're the only Jews in the world.
They were very isolated.
They were very isolated. Well, even today, it's a little difficult to get there. Now there's a paved road, but in those days, it was a dirt road up in the mountains. So this family then went underground again. This man, his name is Samuel Schwartz from Poland, wrote several articles about them. But then they went underground again and were sort of rediscovered in the 1980s. And today there's about 250 to 300 of them that have returned to Judaism. They would go to church, and as they entered the church, they would say under their breath in Portuguese, "We come not to worship wood or stone. We come only to worship you, our God." After church, they would go home and have a Jewish service in their basements. When a baby was born, they would go have a naming ceremony in the church, a baptism, and then have a Jewish naming ceremony in their basements. For a wedding, they would have the Jewish wedding 1 or 2 days before the Catholic wedding and make sure that the bride and groom had slept together before the Catholic wedding. It's a good
Interesting, okay.
Anyway, and then 1 week before Easter, they would have what they call the Santa Festa, the Holy Feast or Passover. They would make unleavened bread, and they would tell a story about Moses being expelled from Egypt by the Inquisition.
By the Inquisition.
Their story.
Slight change of history there.
Right. Anyway, in 1988, they returned to practicing Judaism openly. And a group here, mainly in the United States, raised money to send them a rabbi. The first rabbi was a man from Morocco.
A Portuguese-speaking rabbi.
Well, the first one didn't speak Portuguese.
Okay.
The second one is a rabbi from Chile who spoke Spanish, but that's close enough to where they can communicate. But this young man in the picture you just saw, he is today in Israel studying to be a rabbi. He is now finishing his 3rd year of study. I'm with a group that is raising money for his tuition. He's got 1 more year to study. And in 1 more year, he will be the first homegrown rabbi in 500 years in that area.
That's quite a historical significance.
Yes.
And tell me that obviously they must have cemeteries there. Were the graves marked in any special way to trace?
The graves were all Catholic graves. However, very often they would have some secret symbol on them, like perhaps they'd put a flower, a rose or something. But the flower would have 6 petals, sort of resembling the Jewish cross with 6 points. Sometimes Oh, at one time, when I visited the cemetery, they said, "Come look, there's a Jewish symbol on this grave," and I saw nothing that I took to be Jewish, but there was a dove, and they said, "Oh, the dove is a Jewish symbol." Well, I'd never heard of the dove being a Jewish symbol, but to them it was a Jewish symbol, so they did it. Now, since they came out into the open in 1980, 87, 88, they have added Stars of David to many of these graves.
So retrofitted something.
Yes, yeah.
Now, another story you've told about the kissing of Madonna's foot, which also started from that period of time.
Right. There is a woman that lives here in the valley. She lives in Tarzana, named Trudy Alexi, and she wrote a book called The Mezuzah in the Madonna's Foot. And the book is mainly about her own story, but part of the book tells about a priest living in the United States today who was from a secret Jewish family. And in his family, they have a statue of the Madonna near the door. And as they exit and come in, they kiss the foot of the Madonna. And hidden in the foot is a mezuzah. Now, the mezuzah, for those who don't know, is by Hebrew tradition, we are to the Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. The affirmation that there's only one God. And Jews are ordered to post this on the doorposts of your house, teach it to your children, etc. So a Jewish house has a mezuzah, a little, usually it's stone or metal, with this written inside. So this mezuzah is hidden in a Madonna's foot. Well, on the internet, I found a young man in Brazil who had discovered his Jewish background. So I contacted him, and he sent me the story of his family, how they would light candles and they wouldn't eat pork, etc. And then one day he sent me an email entitled "The Mezuzah in the Madonna's Feet." And I thought he was asking me about Trudy Alexi's book. But he wasn't. When I read it, he was describing what his family did. And it was exactly the same thing that was done by this family in the United States.
Okay, so then obviously the ones that have been practicing this ritual come from the similar area, because they would have to have collaborated. Says, okay, this is what we're going to do.
Well, I'm not sure if they're from us. It could be that they were separate, that these things came about separately, but since the people had the same experiences before, they would make the same conclusions.
Yeah, and of course we had talked earlier about how what remains after so many years, so many hundreds of years, are the rituals, the tradition of the rituals. And even though we've lost the idea why we're doing it, some of these people are discovering it for the first time, the reason for it.
I found people in New Mexico, for instance, of a woman describing how they would always clean the house and dress in clean clothes on Friday before sundown. 1 week before Easter, they'd have a big meal where they ate a big flat cracker. There's a town in Brazil called Venhaver, and it's way out in the hinterland. And in this town, they don't eat bread in the week of Lent before Easter, which is the Passover.
Right.
I had a person in New Mexico and then another person in Brazil. Both describe how their grandparents or their grandfathers would slaughter animals. Virtually the word for word the same. They would say that my grandfather would take a knife, first check it with his thumbnail to make sure that there were no nicks in the knife, that it had to be pure, then cut the animal's neck, drain the blood, and remove a nerve from the leg. Well, this is kosher slaughtering.
Right.
And drain the blood into the ground. Perfect kosher slaughtering. Families in New Mexico at a funeral, after a funeral, they would cover the mirrors of their house, which was an old Jewish symbol, practice. The family would sit on the floor. They would rip their clothing, all old Jewish practices.
Interesting. And after they've been doing it for so many years, now to find out why they're doing it.
Yes.
It's quite amazing.
Yes.
Now, I also want to touch on, there's a publication that your organization has.
I'm the co-editor of a newsletter called Halapid, Halapid. The name means the torch in Hebrew. We took the name from a newspaper, a newsletter that was published in Portugal in the 1920s. It was published by a man named Arturo Carlos Barros Bastos. He's also the founder of the Portuguese Boy Scouts. In the 1920s, he announced that his family were secret Jews, and he was beginning to practice openly. Oh, on my last trip to Portugal a few years ago, I met his daughter, and she gave me a copy of his original newspaper.
Very nice. The original.
Yes.
So, what any plans for the future, or what any places you're going to go?
I go back to Spain and Portugal like every 2 or 3 years or so, and I would like to go back within the next year or two.
Okay, so you maintain contact with all of these people, same people?
Yes.
Or do you go explore new areas that you've just...
Well, a little of both. I'm involved with 2 groups now. One, which I mentioned, is raising money for the tuition for this young man that's studying to be a rabbi, and another that's raising money to send a teacher to Belmont. And there's also crypto Jews in other cities in Portugal. And so I'm in contact with them regularly.
Now, Arthur, you have a website that if anybody wants to have more information, it's cryptojews.com, right?
Cryptojews.com. And I've posted most of the articles from our newsletter there, including several that I wrote myself.
And they're written in English? Are they
Yes.
also in Spanish? And
They're all in English. Some of them were originally written in Spanish or Portuguese, but we've translated them.
okay. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, Arthur.
Okay, thank you.
But it was most interesting and very informative. And I hope some people that have watched this thing, all of a sudden a light goes on and says, hey, now I know why we would be doing that.
Yes.
Thank you very much for being on the
Thank you.
show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay.
Thank you.